Welcome and thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm Charlie Imbergamo, Director of Strategic Programs for the Nonprofit Leadership Center. Our NLC team is continuing our commitment to develop and connect leaders across our region to strengthen our communities, and we're delighted that you're with us. A few weeks back, which seems like an eternity ago, during our first week of working remotely, today's presenter invited us to participate in a virtual convening for her clients and her colleagues. And it was from that invitation that the thought of today's webinar was born. So much has shifted in the last couple of weeks, and communication in general, how we communicate, our strategy, our tone, our alignment to our impact is normally critically important. But as we look forward to the future, clarity and communication, consistency and hope around our organizations and our organization's impact is really key. It's an honor for us to invite you into this virtual space for today's webinar, Communicate to Thrive in a Post-Pandemic World. To recognize and to celebrate the organizations that you represent, we'd ask you, as we have before, to locate the chat box and to type the name of your organization in the chat right now. And as we're watching and seeing the names of your organizations pop into the feed, let's all take a moment to recognize the incredible potential, the potential for good that exists in this community because of each of you and your organizations. Just let that sink in for a moment. Heather Grzelka enjoys nearly 20 years of experience advancing social causes by generating positive media attention and influencing policymakers and increasing donor support. Before founding Madeira Public Relations, Heather spent the first decade of her career successfully navigating Washington, D.C. and its political arena on behalf of numerous nationally recognized nonprofits. She's a graduate of George Mason University, public health advocate, a nonprofit board member, an animal advocate, a regular NLC trainer, and an accomplished public relations professional. We're delighted to have Heather with us today. Moderating our webinar is my colleague and teammate, Karina Kletter. Karina has been the backbone of a lot of this work in the organization and the virtual planning, and very grateful to Karina and to her dedication to this community and to our work. She will take us through some rules of the road for our time together. Karina.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everybody who's here with us today, and thank you to Heather. A few rules of the road for today's webinar. To minimize the background noise and distractions, we'll have all lines muted for the duration of the webinar. The session is being recorded and will be available on our website for future viewing. We warmly welcome your questions. If you would type them in the chat box as they come up for you, we'll take 10 to 15 minutes at the end of Heather's presentation for her to answer as many as we're able to get to. If you haven't found the chat box yet, you go to the settings at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on chat. We're looking forward to a productive, engaging session, and thank you so much for your participation. On to you, Heather.
Hello, I'm glad to be here, and thank you to everyone for taking the time out of their day to be a part of this. We are going to cover a lot of ground today in a very short period of time. These certainly are uncertain times, and it's hard to plan for the future when the day-to-day work of staying afloat is really so challenging. It's hard for me to believe, but this is now my third recession since graduating college. And I'm going to share with you today some valuable lessons I learned during the housing crash of 2008 when I was working at a national public health nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Uncertainty is undoubtedly the new normal, And with that in mind, we'll also discuss the one thing organizations cannot stop doing while social distancing orders are still somewhat in place, as we now know, and procedures that your organization must prepare to implement in this new climate. There's no magic fix, and rough times are absolutely ahead. We can't deny that. The current news cycle suggests that we should prepare for a second wave of this pandemic this fall and winter. The majority of nonprofits I've spoken with in this past month or so have shared financial struggles, concerns over whether to continue planning events scheduled for this fall or early next year, and also concern over not being able to serve the community in the same capacity as before because of social distancing orders. Despite the uncertainty that we're all facing, there are steps that your organization can begin taking now to regain your footing once this pandemic is finally behind us, and one day it will finally be behind us. So let's go back in time again to the last recession that was caused by the housing market crash. At the time, I was the Media Relations Director for the nation's leading lung health advocacy organization. At the time, these stamps that you see here, known as Christmas seals, were our main source of revenue. The average age of our donors at the time was more than 80 years old. This was not a sustainable business model at all. And so we needed to figure out a plan to pull us through the recession. A little back information on Christmas seals. They were introduced in the early 1900s and were sometimes used in place of twine when wrapping holiday gifts, as tape was not invented until 1930. So the seals served an important purpose at one point in time, but in today's world, they were not inclusive of the many people who do not celebrate Christmas, but also care deeply about lung health. So rather than sit down and brainstorm a bunch of ideas to supplement revenue generated by our Christmas seals campaign, a great amount of time, money, and staff resources were invested in developing a strategic plan that would lead the organization through the recession and beyond. That process began with bringing on a research consultant who provided an in-depth picture of our donors and stakeholders. You can see here how the data help pinpoint discrepancies between the organization's work and its importance to our stakeholders. Notice the significant divide between association with organization and importance to people in topics such as healthy air and pollution. The divide is quite significant. If we had simply sat down to brainstorm what would likely have been great ideas, we would have never known what our key stakeholders truly wanted and expected from the organization now more than a decade ago. And I mentioned the significant passage of time since this research was conducted because stakeholders' values evolve. What you thought you knew about your donors and stakeholders before COVID may not necessarily be true today. And it was really quite, I don't want to say a surprise to us, but to a certain extent it was to see how interested people were in topics surrounding air pollution and healthy air, which connects back to the environment. Digging in deeper to this audience research, the organization was able to identify the characteristics of its core donors and stakeholders. So here you see is an example of a few of the key market segments that were identified. Their lifestyle and their belief systems, along with guidance on messaging strategies and communication channels that we needed to use to reach these audiences. The concerned and overwhelmed category that you see at the top is one that has stayed with me. It's easy to see this audience in many of the organizations' audiences that they serve. These are folks who have said about themselves in this survey format that they dread the future, they don't really know what's important to them, they know they need to prioritize their commitments, they're worried about money, they don't lead a healthy lifestyle, but there's too much information to make sense of it all. And we were able to ascertain through this information that this group really just needed simple, straightforward messaging on ways that they could take control of their health. And then we came across our extrovert environmentalists, which harkens back to the previous slide, where we found a large majority of our stakeholders really cared about air pollution and wanted this organization to do something about it. So these folks within the confines of the survey describe themselves as being extroverted, outgoing, enthusiastic. They love going to meet people. They consider themselves politically liberal. But then, as you can see underneath, we had another strong stakeholder group that considered themselves conservative. And so we had a wide bunch of people, and we learned that we needed to create not only new programs, but also reconsider how we message to these vastly different audiences. So of course, much more data was collected. That is a very small snippet of the larger data. Frankly, we would need much more than an hour together for me to go through the complete data, but I think it gives you a sense of where we started from in gathering information. And the bottom line is this: gaining a better understanding of your stakeholders, specifically donors, the organization was able to frame its strategic plan and frame its programming and messaging in a way that resonated most with stakeholders and prospective donors. Addressing air quality issues had long been part of the mission. However, the organization was loudest at the time in the tobacco control arena, leading some to perceive it as the Quit Smoking Association, which is not necessarily a bad thing, although it clearly excluded a large swath of our potential audience. So with this newfound information that air quality is a top concern, a campaign was created to protect the Clean Air Act that remains in play today and involves close to a dozen dedicated staff members and contractors around the nation. And I eventually became one of those contractors who worked on that as part of my company that I now have today. So as an early response to this data, this ad, which I'm going to show you in a second, was created and distributed as a PSA. We didn't have the budget to endeavor to buy a national ad campaign at that time. Also keep in mind, more than 10 years ago, that the reach and power of social media was very different than it is today. And so that's why we chose to create a PSA to distribute to television channels here. So I'm going to just quick put play. Let's see if we can do this.
We're fighting to make every section a smoke-free section. For a day when even vehicles quit smoking, we're fighting for clear skies over every city. The American Lung Association isn't just fighting for air, we're fighting for all the things that make it worth breathing. Join us in the fight at fightingforair.org.
So hopefully you can see how that commercial really tied back to some of that earlier messaging that we were able to verify within our research. The Christmas Seals fundraiser still remains in play, actually, even today. It's always been a successful tool, but taking the time to conduct research and developing a marketing and communication strategy based on that information allowed the organization to widen its circle of stakeholders and donors and empowered the organization to not only survive the recession, but also come out the other side stronger and even more financially stable. Christmas Seals were framed as a nostalgic icon with ads such as these that I'm going to show you.
We wish you a Merry Christmas.
The American Lung Association asks you to remember that every Christmas carol begins with healthy lungs. For more than 100 years, your gifts to Christmas Seals have helped us fight for healthy lungs and air. Help us celebrate another year. Go to christmasseals.org.
So at the time, commercials that had a nod to nostalgia were really popular advertising and marketing trend. A lot of candy companies at the time were going back to their old packaging. And nostalgia really in hard times activates a feeling of nostalgia and also demonstrates brand longevity. So it's something you may want to consider if it is relevant to your brand. So the key thing to ask your leadership right now, even before embarking on research, is what does success look like? Where do you want to be a year from now and even 5 years from now? Getting everyone to share the same vision of success is often easier said than done. Often when we meet with boards to initiate this process, financial goals are more often than not linked to success. And I'd encourage you to dig deeper into these conversations and focus on tangible outcomes as it relates to the cause or the people that you serve so that it best aligns with your mission. Sometimes it's obvious if you've met your goal for success. Oftentimes success is a long, ongoing process. In the case for the Fight for Healthy Air, that's really an ongoing endeavor measured by small milestone markers of success. These are the evaluation metrics we use to guide the success of the communications plan. For the most part, these are all targets that are relatively easy to measure and are also strong indicators of whether applied strategies and tactics are truly moving the needle. Any marketing and communications plan worth its weight must be equal parts measurable and aspirational. Sometimes knowing your measurement capabilities before diving in can help guide discussions surrounding objectives and tactics. Having baseline data to work from also makes it possible to set realistic goals and expectations. So, what if you don't have a budget to hire a research consultant or to conduct in-depth surveys? There are plenty of other resources that you have at your fingertips that can help you better understand your stakeholders and public awareness of your mission. Surveys are always useful as they can provide strong quantitative or measurable data. We also have deployed what I like to call hybrid focus groups with great success. Sometimes that means bringing several thought leaders together to discuss issues and ideas. Some of the most valuable information, though, we have gotten from stakeholders has been through making phone calls with 4 or 5 questions on hand, while also allowing the person on the other end of the line to speak their mind and essentially go off script. So through this process, we have discovered various grievances that hadn't been addressed and even safety issues. The bottom line is to use the free and low-cost digital tools available to you while also prioritizing taking the time to simply just listen to your stakeholders. People really need to be heard. This is the basic structure to follow to create a marketing and communications plan for your organization. In addition to defining your measures of success, it can also be helpful to identify the problem to which your plan will resolve. This may not be applicable in all cases, but if there are issues that need to be addressed, it's essential to reach consensus with your leadership and define possible issues or problems without assigning blame or solutions. Following this webinar, you will receive links to a few handouts. One is a SWOT analysis. This is a brainstorming exercise that seeks to identify your organization's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It can be helpful in identifying problems and also untapped potential. As the pandemic has changed the way in which most organizations function, I'd recommend everyone taking the time to complete a SWOT analysis, including participation from all levels of your organization. Just this data alone should help guide you in how best to move forward and where you can best direct your resources for maximum impact. Once you analyze your research, the next step is to define your goals and objectives. So as you can see here, goals can be aspirational. We may never fully end domestic violence in Pinellas County, as hard as that is to wrap our heads around. But we can continually take measurable steps towards this goal, with the exception of, at the very least, seeing a reduction in reported incidents as an example. Objectives are always measurable outcomes that directly support your goal and should be written using the following formula. Name what you're going to do. Then identify the unit of success to measure and how it will be tracked against a specific time frame. And for bonus points, include how exactly you are going to measure the outcome of that objective. So you can see at the bottom objective is written in that exact format. Increase website returning visitor rate by 10% within 1 year, to be measured by tracking monthly and quarterly progress using Google Analytics. So we name what we're going to do, by what amount are we measuring the success, what do we need to accomplish to move the needle, and by how much, and then how are we going, within what time frame, and then how are we going to measure that we have actually made that 10% increase in this example. Once your objectives are established, That's when you begin brainstorming tactics that support achieving your stated objectives. So many of our organizations start with the brainstorming of tactics, and this process is really a more thoughtful way to ensure that you are moving forward in a manner that really resonates most with your stakeholders. Here's another way to present that same formula, particularly if your organization has multiple goals it's working towards. Here, you'll see the mission is clearly stated, the measurement or benchmark that will indicate that the goal has been met, alongside the objectives that support measurable progress towards this worthy yet aspirational goal. Here's another look framing operational goals, following the same formula of noting indicators of success that support measurable progress towards the goal of generating revenue and public support to further the organization's mission. You'll see the plan was thoughtful in its timeline, providing just shy of 8 years to double the organization's revenue stream. Here is an even more direct formula to follow when building your plan to carry you through the pandemic. Start with whatever research you can afford. Define your goals, objectives, and supporting tactics. To be clear, tactics are all the actions you take to reach your objectives and can include hosting events, distributing a newsletter, revamping your website, and so forth. Really, the plan itself is just 2 simple steps. Conduct research and use that information to set thoughtful goals and objectives. You then implement your tactics and measure to see if they brought you any closer to meeting your objectives, and then, of course, achieving your goals. Keep doing more of what works and scrap anything that doesn't yield results, and continue to repeat this ongoing process of collecting more data and adjusting course according to your data outcome. We have now established that having a plan is essential to navigating these tumultuous times and coming out the other side as a trusted and financially stable leader. So what should you be doing right now while we are in the thick of this situation? The short answer is communicating with your stakeholders as much as possible and in as many ways as possible. Newsletters, social media, your website, media interviews, letters, phone calls. Invest the time and energy to stay top of mind. During economic downturns, marketing and communication staff are often the first cut. And while my opinion may sound biased, this is exactly when you need to be getting your message out there most, and in a thoughtful and strategic manner. So you may be wondering, how often should you post content on social media? And there's really no magic number, and results will vary widely just based on the quality of your content, along with the reach and scope of your audience. As a general rule of thumb, though, some studies suggest you can grow your Instagram audience by posting just once a day. With Facebook, I have found that less is more. Shoot for once a day at most. However, 4 times a week is likely just as effective, if not more, as you don't want to become an annoyance in your followers' newsfeed. I'm sure we've seen a few organizations where that is the case. I've personally stopped giving much time to Twitter unless I'm issuing statements or using it as an advocacy tool. I find that it's a bit of a black hole, with the average lifetime of a tweet only lasting 18 minutes at most, which means you need to post at least 10 times a day to maximize your reach. Unless that's a driving indicator to achieve one of your goals, I'm finding it's not the best use of time, as most nonprofits don't have the luxury of having a full-time social media staffer or team. Finally, if you have a presence on LinkedIn, I'd advise posting no more than 3 times a week. Also, in your follow-up packet, you'll receive a link to an interview we conducted with a broadcast news producer that provides tips on how to pitch news media during the pandemic that will help you frame story ideas and get a general leg up on your ability to place stories in our local news market. With all this talk about stakeholders, I would be remiss to not mention that your employees and your volunteers are your most valuable audience and best brand ambassadors. During this time of uncertainty, internal communications is more important than ever before. Make sure your staff know you are doing everything you can to protect their well-being during this epidemic. Take time to listen, answer questions, and address concerns. Be honest about job stability and cuts that may be coming down the line. In essence, it's your job to squash the rumor mill by positioning your top leadership as the authoritative resource. If you're a Brene Brown devotee as I am, you'll know that the stories we tell ourselves don't always reflect the reality of the situation. Allowing your staff to open and honestly express their concerns reduces rumors, builds trust, and equips you with the loyal brand ambassadors you need most right now. If your staff feels differently, you can be sure they will use their own communication channels to frame your organization in a less than positive light. I know one of the things I valued most during the last recession was when our senior vice president took the time to stop by everyone's desk to personally address each person's concerns and remind them of how much their commitment to the organization was valued. So prior to that, the story I had been telling myself was that I was the last one hired, and I was surely going to be the first one fired. I had just gotten married, and you can imagine how nerve-wracking that situation was and the anxiety a lot of us on that staff were feeling. I learned through those conversations that my job was safe, and instead of spending any spare moment of thought worrying about my job search, I was able to dig in unencumbered with the unnecessary worry and just simply focus on my job. So consider this. Wellness has multiple facets, many of which we can link back to our employer. Before speaking with your employees, consider how much each of these 8 dimensions may apply to the people you lead. A few questions you may want to consider asking yourself are, have you done everything you can to make the workplace safe? Are you willing to adjust how you operate, not just in the short term, but for the foreseeable future, to allow staff to telework as is logistically feasible? Have you provided the appropriate access to resources to make teleworking as productive as possible? Have you addressed your team's financial concerns and emotional needs during this trying time? Once you have adequately addressed the needs of your staff and your volunteers, evaluate your communication with your stakeholders and then your wider public audience. Some organizations are really doing an excellent job of this, and I believe Feeding Tampa Bay is one. When you visit their website, at the very top is clear information on their COVID response, along with what supporters can do to help. That last part is really essential. Assumptions are dangerous, so we cannot assume our stakeholders are aware of policy or operational changes that may have had to be implemented in response to the pandemic. We can't assume those we serve know our organizations are even still open. We also can't assume those who care about our mission know even how best to help us right now, particularly if they don't have money to give, but if there are other ways that you may possibly need help. This information needs to be spelled out clearly and should be the very first thing people see on your website right now. We are all in the middle of a crisis situation. Your website is the very first place people are going to look for information, making it essential to lead with all relevant COVID information on your website right now. We just simply cannot expect people to dig for it. So we know that the economy is being turned back on, however you want to interpret that. And we're in a very interesting and fluid time right now. And we have a lot to consider, along with new policies and procedures that we may need to implement. And there's no one-size-fits solution for any organization, nonprofit, for-profit. You need to consider what is in the best interest of your employees and then the audience that you serve. Your response during this time of transition is essential to protecting your reputation. We are already beginning to see lawsuits against employers and employees speaking directly to the news media regarding unsafe working conditions. Just yesterday, you may have seen on television, some of the flight attendants are talking about how they don't feel safe in doing their jobs. That's not exactly positive PR or should make anyone feel comfortable about getting on an airplane right now. We know this virus is going to be with us for a while. So shifting operational strategies is to be expected, and it will need to be communicated in clear detail with all of your stakeholders. And your changes may prevent you from operating at your pre-COVID capacity. And my recommendation, if you take nothing away from this time we have together, my recommendation is to err on the side of caution, prioritizing the health and safety first of your volunteers and employees, and then of those that you serve. The safest and wisest approach right now is to heed the advice of our top public health experts and to continue to implement social distancing measures until it is no longer necessary to do so. USA Today released a study, I believe today, and it found that the majority of people believe and follow Dr. Fauci, that he is their most trusted advisor right now during the pandemic. And then their second most trusted advisor is the governor of their state. So following who your audience trusts is also important. And so depending on your organizational structure, this may mean having to implement new policies to enter and exit your workplace. Perhaps you may need to require all staff and visitors to wear a face mask and provide proper training on how to safely wear and wash reusable cloth masks. If your organization serves vulnerable populations, you may want to consider taking temperature checks before allowing these individuals to enter your workspace, although we know this is not a sufficient guarantee that someone is not carrying the virus. As we now know, it can be spread when individuals are asymptomatic. We also need to allow employees who are not feeling well to stay home. For many organizations, this will be a huge culture shift. We are a hard-working culture, and one that doesn't always look kindly on someone who misses work because they have just a cold or a tickle in their throat. Many offices have policies that an employee must get a doctor's note if they miss more than 2 days of work. Obtaining a doctor's note for a cold or for someone who feels like they may be getting sick is not a realistic expectation. Trusting our employees to do the right thing and to work from home to avoid making others sick needs to become standard operating procedure. Strictly enforcing hand washing and workplace sanitizing policies must forever become the new norm. Assuring your staff and those you serve of the actions you're taking to protect their safety are essential. They must also see top leadership enforce and adhere to these standards and practices. We saw how the news blew up that our vice president visited a hospital and didn't wear a mask. You need the top leadership within your organization needs to follow the rules that you are placing for your employees to follow. And isn't it amazing what the appearance of a bottle of Purell can do? And while it's still hard to find, planning to place hand sanitizer stations around your workplace now needs to be as commonplace as any other essential office equipment. My advice to you today is to proceed with caution. Err on the side of safety over revenue. And I know that's hard to do. Develop policies and procedures that reflect the advice of leading health scientists. Invest in the time to forge a data-driven plan that carries your organization through the next 1 to 3 years. Stay in touch with your key stakeholders at what is likely a greater frequency than before the pandemic. Keep in mind your stakeholders include your staff and volunteers. When developing messaging, communicate within before taking any information public to build and maintain trust. We have covered a lot of ground today, and I hope this information will be helpful to your organizations as you continue to navigate our new normal. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was really wonderful, helpful, and I think sort of underlines a lot of the practices that we're already sort of putting into place here at NLC. I had a couple of questions. I don't see any coming in yet into the chat, so I want to first remind everybody, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll get them to Heather for her to answer. But I will start things off by asking, what are your thoughts on if the people that are being served by an organization are upset because the organization is continuing to adhere to social distancing guidelines beyond what has maybe been ordered by elected officials?
I think that's valid and something that is probably going to come up for a lot of organizations who are public facing. And that is why over communicating right now is so important, and not just delivering the news as kind of this new wave of information, but slowly building on this messaging and your organization's philosophy on health and safety. And then eventually you will hopefully get buy-in that you're trying to protect the health of those that you serve. But it is a ongoing process. You need to continually message and make updates and let people know what you are considering for the future, that maybe this isn't the way that you're going to always operate, but this is how you're going to operate for now.
Great, that was really helpful. Thank you. Any questions? Let's see. Not seeing any questions yet. Charlie, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask Heather while we wait for anybody else to chime in?
Heather, how long does it take to develop a strategic communications plan, and what steps would you recommend for starting steps for people who might not already have one to begin to create one during this time?
That's a good question. And we have worked on numerous strategic plans, and it's really important to have buy-in from your top leadership, so that means your board as well. And so you need to get them to the table. So what I have found is it typically takes between 3 and 4 months to really put a solid plan together. And that's because usually the first month is all completely dedicated to research. And one thing I want to add on that, and when you're talking about, well, how should you start? Not all research has to be your own research. There's a lot of data out there where you can pull data and benchmark data and use that to help you build your plan. There is a public interest communications firm called M&R, and they publish what is a benchmarking survey of nonprofits every year. And the 2020 survey was just released publicly this week, and there's a lot of really good data in there. And frankly, we use some of that data quite frequently when we're building communication plans. So if you Google M&R, the letters M&R benchmarking survey, you will certainly find that information.
Thank you, Heather. We've got a couple of questions coming in. First is from Jane Morse Swot. And Jane, I want to make sure that I have this correct, so you can chime in the chat to let me know. Jane asks, what are your thoughts about fundraising with crowds in the future? And that sounds like maybe like fundraising events like galas and things like that. Is that accurate, right, Jane?
Yeah, so many of us are doing fashion shows and all those kinds of things. And it's like, okay, you kind of think that, okay, what's going to happen is you're not going to get the number of attendees that you perhaps have gotten in the past, and you're outlaying all this money for a great event. How, do you think that's going to, I think personally it's going to put a detriment on getting people to come. Do you have any thoughts on that? You said to err on the side of caution, and it's making me nervous.
It's making me nervous too, Jane, and I really think that your instincts are in the right place. I'm serving on the NAMI walk committee, and they're supposed to be having their big first annual walk, and we've been so excited about it. And it's hard to plan for such an uncertain future. And we're hearing from Dr. Fauci that this fall and winter could be a strong uptick in this pandemic. And so really, until we have a vaccine and we're at a more normal level, whatever that's going to look like in the future, I think finding other ways to generate revenue are essential. And you know, just talking about the organization earlier, I just wanted to tell you that they're in our communications plan, there wasn't anything about events or doing things like that. The organization does events, but it is not their lead form of fundraising. And so this is going to be a challenging time to start thinking of other ways to do that, but not in person.
Thank you, Heather. We've got a couple more questions coming in, and everybody, you can keep the questions coming. We've got a bit more time. We have a question from Shelley, and Shelley asks, she says that you mentioned Feeding Tampa Bay is doing a good job with their communications, and she wonders if there are other organizations that you think are doing a good job.
That's a good question. I think a lot of the nonprofits in our community are doing a good job, but again, if you're communicating at the same pace as you were before the pandemic, you really need to pick up the pace a bit more, otherwise you're just going to be drowned out. I've noticed that some of the animal shelters, Friends of Strays, is also doing a really good job. The animal welfare community has been hit hard with this pandemic in the sense that there's been a lot of rumors that your pets can transfer the virus to you, but now we know it sounds like it's more likely that we can transmit the virus to cats, which has been a strange and unfortunate finding. So Friends of Strays has been posting information on what is the latest data in that regard. They've had to close their traditional adoption processes where you can't go in person right now, but they still are in great need of assistance, and so they have spelled out very clearly on their website what it is they need and what you can do to continue to be a supporter of their organization. So I'm really impressed by what they've done there.
Great, thank you, Heather. We have one more question right now. The question is from Diana. She asks, how do you recommend balancing over-communicating when all organizations are doing just that, saturating the market with fundraising campaigns and updates and overwhelming stakeholders?
So I think you have to keep in mind, and this is where we start at the very beginning, of knowing who your key stakeholders are. And these are the people who are most passionate about your mission and care about your mission no matter what is happening. And so people who care about animal welfare may not necessarily be the same people who are really excited about what Feeding Tampa Bay is doing. Not saying that there is an overlap, but consider that you're not really always reaching all of the same people. You are strategically targeting the people that you know are your stakeholders. And the goal is simply to stay top of mind, because if you're not, then when times are better and people have more money to give, they forget that you need it, and you need to show them that you are still serving the mission with their support.
Thank you, Heather. Let's see. Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. I have one last question. And again, everybody feel free to keep typing your questions in the chat box. We do have some more time. So I'll just go back a little bit to putting together a plan in a time like this. And if your supervisor or boss or a higher up might say that there is no budget or time to put together a plan, as crucial as a plan may be, but there might not be support from that angle. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would suggest starting slow and sometimes looking at this big plan and all the things you need to do and all the people you need to bring together, that can be overwhelming, and especially with everything that you're probably juggling right now within your organizations. So I would recommend starting small, and maybe that's checking out that benchmarking survey and bringing some data to the table that's relevant to your organization. Maybe it's putting together a survey in SurveyMonkey and sending it out to your staff or your donors or other segments of your list, and maybe that data will be intriguing enough for your leadership to want you to continue to do more. And once you have that data, putting the rest of the plan together really falls into place and is not as daunting as the process of it sounds. The data really tells you what it is you need to do. And so if you can slowly gather that, you will get support to create a plan.
Great. Thank you so much for answering that question, Heather. I feel like it's probably top of mind for a lot of people who are maybe they're thinking resources ought to go in other directions. I'm not seeing any other questions coming into the chat box. Heather, are there any? Oh, we just got another one. Here we go. David Stone asks, might you please elaborate on your comments that social media / websites should be updated up to 10 times a day? This seems almost impossible unless, as you noted, a nonprofit has a full-time IT or media person, which few do.
You are correct. So I want to clarify that up to 10 times a day was a Twitter statistic, in that if you wanted to really make a dent in Twitter, because a tweet on average has a lifespan of 18 minutes, you would need to post 10 times a day to really get the audience reach that you might have on other platforms. And I don't use Twitter much myself anymore. It's a valuable tool when I'm helping a client navigate a crisis. It's a place where reporters will look for a statement or an update. I use it as an advocacy tool when we're helping clients push policy initiatives, because folks on Capitol Hill follow tweets and that kind of information. So it's just another tool in our toolbox. But on a day-to-day basis, unless you have a dedicated staff to help you with social media, I would focus on where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And so I'm seeing a lot of growth still in the Instagram space. For some organizations, LinkedIn is super effective. Facebook is still a great place, but I think it's not what it used to be. And I'm finding that if you're not putting money behind your posts, then your posts kind of reach, like if you're really trying to reach a local audience here, then your post sometimes goes far beyond where you're trying to reach. And so if you put a little money behind your posts and you're really intentional with what you're posting, you can better frame and target the audience that you're trying to reach.
Thank you, Heather. And I just want to confirm what I had heard you say earlier when you were speaking to that. I think you said for Facebook, something like once a day at the most.
Once a day most.
And LinkedIn, I think a few times a week, so not even daily on LinkedIn. So much more minimal than a Twitter engagement. And
I really personally do not think you need to post on Facebook once a day. I firmly believe that 4 times a week is enough. Now we do see there is pretty good data with Instagram that once a day is kind of a sweet spot. And then there are some brands that post like as many as like 30 times a day on Instagram, and it works for them. It's not realistic for just about any nonprofit I've ever worked with, and I find it to be overkill. But you have to kind of find what your own sweet spot is, and you know where your sweet spot is by the amount of interaction your posts are getting on the channel that you are posting that information.
Okay, I see we have one more question from Liz Mendez-Pena. And this goes back to virtual events. Liz asks, what do you think about the virtual events, and what is the biggest challenge with this type of event?
That's a really good question. My opinion is still forming on these virtual events. Like you, I'm starting to participate in them myself. I find them so much harder. You know, we're here in this big group, but it's too challenging for us to really even talk to one another. And so if we were in the traditional classroom space, this whole program today would look very different. You know, we'd be able to do some exercises and, you know, practice a few things, and you're a little bit more limited in this environment. I do like with Zoom that you can break people up into groups, because I feel like once you get beyond like 8 or 10 people, you can't talk and really get any value out of it. Now, I did see, and I'm going back to animal welfare again, because that's one of my key passions, and I'm on a lot of mailing lists. The Humane Society is doing a concert tonight, an online concert, and it's a fundraiser / fundraiser for them. And I'm curious to see what the data is from that. And I think we need to start to see data to really know if this is a good use of our time.
Right, that makes sense. We'll only know in retrospect when we get the data, right? Okay, we have one question coming in from Ana Diaz. And Ana asks, if you're a nonprofit arts organization that provides entertainment, do you think that posting entertainment in platforms such as Facebook and Instagram daily would be okay, or would you still feel that 4 times a week on Facebook would be okay?
If you have content that you can post daily on Facebook, then do it. The key thing is really posting meaningful content, and it sounds like what you have is something that's incredibly visual. We'll probably add some levity in this situation for people who are scrolling through social media. So if you can do that, I would absolutely, for your organization, a little bit more makes sense.
That's great. Thank you, Heather. I know for me personally, I've seen, I follow the San Francisco Ballet of all organizations, and they've been posting their at-home Zoom practice sessions, which is actually really lovely to watch. And I find those to be very welcome way to break up my Facebook feed, to have stuff like that in it as often as possible.
Right. And it's not salesy, right? But you're still remembering that this ballet company exists. So when you can buy tickets in the future, or you're in California, you'll remember how much you've enjoyed them and you will want more, right? I think that's kind of the intent of what we're going after in this particular environment.
I think that was the last of our questions. If there are any last questions, you can type them in the chat box. Heather, do you have any last comments you would like to share with everybody?
I think it's just a little bit of hope, and we need to remain hopeful, and we need to communicate hope to our audiences. We will get through this. We've gotten through a lot of hard times that have hurt our economy. Have we had a pandemic recently? No, but 9/11 took a huge hit on our economy. We made it through the housing crash. We are a resilient people, and know that this is just what's happening right now, and times will get better.
Well, thank you so much, Heather, again, for this wonderful presentation. Extremely informative and timely. Thank you, everybody that participated today, and please reach out to us if you have any questions, and keep your eyes out for our upcoming webinars. This webinar, the recording should be posted by early next week, if not sooner, and we'll also send out a link to the recording, and any of the handouts that Heather referred to, we will include those in the recording link. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.